James Boswell. I'm excited because we're actually into the actual proper writing of James Boswell now. So here on this page we're going to have Advertisement to the second edition. So this is what Boswell wrote to begin the second edition. Here we go. That I was anxious for the success of a work which had employed much of my time and labor, I do not wish to conceal. But whatever doubts I at any time entertained have been entirely removed by the very favorable reception with which it has been honored. That reception has excited my best exertions to render my book more perfect, and in this endeavor I have had the assistance not only of some of my particular friends, but of many other learned and ingenious men, by which I have been enabled to rectify some mistakes, and to enrich the work, which has with many valuable additions. These I have ordered to be printed separately in quarto, for the accommodation of the purchasers of the first edition. Oh, okay, interesting. May I be permitted to say that the typography of both editions does honor to the press of Mr. Henry Baldwin, now master of the worshipful company of stationers, whom I have long known as a worthy man and an obliging friend. What a name, the worshipful company of stationers. So it appears that in the second edition he's not only grateful for the good review and the receipt of the first edition, but he's added to it. And then he's added, the editions are in separate sections so that people that bought the first edition don't have to buy the whole thing again. In the strangely mixed scenes of human existence, our feelings are often at once pleasing and painful. Of this truth, the progress of the present work furnishes a striking instance. It was highly gratifying to me that my friend, Sir Joshua Reynolds, to whom it is inscribed, lived to peruse it, and to give the strongest testimony to its fidelity. But before a second edition, which he contributed to improve, could be finished, the world has been deprived of that most valuable man, a loss of which the regret will be deep and lasting and extensive, proportionate to the felicity which he diffused through a wide circle of admirers and friends. In reflecting that the illustrious subject of this work, by being more extensive and intimately known, however elevated before, has risen in the veneration and love of mankind, I feel a satisfaction beyond what fame can afford. We cannot indeed too much or too often admire his wonderful powers of mind, when we consider that the principal store of wit and wisdom which this work contains was not a particular selection from his general conversation, but was merely his occasional talk at such times as I had the good fortune to be in his company. And without doubt, if his discourse at other periods had been collected with the same attention, the whole tenor of what he uttered would have been found equally excellent. His strong, clear, and animated enforcement of religion, morality, loyalty, and subordination, while it delights and impresses the wise and the good, will, I trust, prove an effectual antidote to that detestable sophistry which has been lately imported from France under the false name of philosophy, and with a malignant industry has been employed against the peace, good order, and happiness of society in our free and prosperous country. But thanks be to God, without producing the pernicious effects which were hoped for by its propagators. It seems to me, in my moments of self-complacency, that this extensive biographical work, however inferior in its nature, may in one respect be assimilated to the Odyssey. Amidst 1,000 entertaining and instructive episodes, the hero is never long out of sight, for they are all in some degree connected with him, and he, in the whole course of the history, is exhibited by the author for the best advantage of his readers. And now there's some Latin there. Quid virtus et quid sapientia possit. I'm going to regret trying to speak Latin. Util proposut nobis exemplar Ulyssen. Whatever that means. Should there be any cold-blooded and morose mortals who really dislike this book, I will give them a story to apply. When the great Duke of Marlborough, accompanied by Lord Cadogan, was one day reconnoitering the army in Flanders, a heavy rain came on, and they both called for their cloaks. Lord Cadogan's servant, a good-humoured, alert lad, brought his lordship's in a minute. The Duke's servant, a lazy, sulky dog, was so sluggish that his grace, being wet to the skin, reproved him, and had for answer with a grunt, "I came as fast as I could," upon which the Duke calmly said, "Cadogan, I would not for £1,000 have that fellow's temper." There are some men, I believe, who have, or think they have, a very small share of vanity. Such may speak of their literary fame in a decorous style of diffidence. But I confess that I am so formed by nature and by habit as to restrain the effusion of delight on having obtained such fame, to me would be truly painful. Why then should I suppress it? Why, out of the abundance of the heart, should I not speak? Let me then mention with a warm but no insolent exultation that I have been regaled with spontaneous praise of my work by many and various persons eminent for their rank, learning, talents, and accomplishments, much of which praise I have under their hands to be reposited in my archives at Arkelec. An honourable and reverend friend, speaking of the favourable reception of my volume, even in the circles of fashion and elegance, said to me, "You have made them all talk Johnson." Yes, I may add, I have Johnsonized the land, and I trust they will not only talk, but think Johnson. To enumerate those to whom I have been thus indebted would be tediously ostentatious. I cannot, however, but name one whose praise is truly valuable, not only on account of his knowledge and abilities, but on account of the magnificent yet dangerous embassy in which he is now employed, which makes everything that relates to him peculiarly interesting. Lord Macartney favoured me with his own copy of my book, with a number of notes of which I have availed myself. On the first leaf I found in his lordship's handwriting an inscription of such high commendation that even I, in vain as I am, cannot prevail on myself to publish it. July 1st, 1793. There's a third an advertisement for the third edition. So we're building. So clearly the book is a success. Several valuable letters and other curious matter have been communicated to the author too late to be arranged in that chronological order which he had endeavored uniformly to observe in his work. He was obliged to introduce them in his second edition, by way of addenda, as commodiously as he could. In the present edition, they have been distributed in their proper places. In revising his volumes for the new edition, he had pointed out where some of these materials should be inserted, but unfortunately, in the midst of his labors, he was seized with a fever, of which, to the great regret of all his friends, he died on the 19th of May, 1795. All the notes that he had written in the margin of the copy which he had in part revised are here faithfully preserved, and a few new notes have been added, principally by some of those friends to whom the author in the former editions acknowledged his obligations. Those subscribed with the letter B were communicated by Dr. Burney. Those with the letter JB are annexed by the Reverend J.B. Blakeway of Shrewsbury, to whom Mr. Boswell acknowledged himself indebted for some judicious remarks on the first edition of his work. And the letters J.B.O. are annexed to some remarks furnished by the author's second son, a student of Brazen Nose College in Oxford. That's a heck of a name for a school. Brazen Nose College. Some valuable observations were communicated by James Bindley, Esquire, first commissioner in the Stamp Office, which have been acknowledged in their proper places. For all those without any signature, Mr. Malone is answerable. Every new remark not written by the author for the sake of distinction has been enclosed within crochets, whatever that is. In one instance, however, the printer, by mistake, has affixed this mark to a note relative to the Reverend Thomas Fitch Palmer, see Volume 3, page 223, which was written by Mr. Boswell, and therefore ought not to have been distinguished. I have only to add that the proof sheets of the present edition, not having passed through my hands, I am not answerable for any typographical errors that may be found in it. Having, however, been printed at the very accurate press of Mr. Baldwin, I make no doubt that it will be found not less perfect than the former edition, the greatest care having been taken by correctness and elegance to do justice in one of the most instructive and entertaining works in the English language. E.D.M. Malone, April 8th, 1799. So clearly Boswell's dead now. And others have taken on the job of adding notes, or advertisements as they call it, a preface as we might call it, to the successive editions of this book. Now we've got another one, advertisement to the 4th edition. I wonder who wrote this. I think somewhere in here, James Boswell's son, James Boswell Jr., gets involved. In this edition are inserted some new letters, of which the greater part has been obligingly communicated by the Reverend Dr. How do you pronounce that? Y-V-S-E. Vizzy? Rector of Lambeth. Those written by Dr. Johnson concerning his mother in her last illness furnish a new proof of his great piety and tenderness of heart, and therefore cannot but be acceptable to the readers of this very popular work. Some new notes also have been added, which, as well as the observations inserted in the 3rd edition and the letters now introduced, are carefully included without crochets, whatever that is, that the author may not be answerable for anything which has not the sanction of his approbation. The remarks of my friends are distinguished as formerly, except those of Mr. Malone, to which the letter M is now subjoined. Those to which the letter K is affixed were communicated by my learned friend, the Reverend Dr. Kearney, formerly Senior Fellow of Trinity College, Dublin, and now beneficed in the Diocese of Rathphoney in Ireland, of which he is Archdeacon. Pardon me. Of a work which has been before the public for 13 years with increasing approbation, and of which near 4,000 copies have been dispersed, it is not necessary to say more. Yet I cannot refrain from adding that, highly as it is now estimated, it will, I am confident, be still more valued by posterity a century hence, when all the actors in this scene shall be numbered with the dead, when the excellent and extraordinary man whose wit and wisdom are here recorded shall be viewed at a still greater distance, and the instruction and entertainment they afford will at once produce reverential gratitude, admiration, and delight. E.M., June 20th, 1804. So now we're into the 19th century. We've made that transition. Can you just imagine if they knew the impact that 250 years, 220 years later, still reading the stuff, and when all that community is dead and gone, and they're dust, not even dust in the ground anymore. Here we go. I don't know what this is. Let's find out. A chronological catalog of the prose works, and then there's an asterisk of Samuel Johnson, LLD. N.B. To those which he, and this is in brackets, N.B. To those which he himself acknowledged is added acknowledge, to those which may be fully believed to be his from internal evidence is added inter-evid. What? To those which, so this is the catalog of, a chronological catalog of the prose works of Samuel Johnson. Now, what does that mean? It can't be that it's not the collection of the prose works, because this is the biography of Johnson, so it's not those prose. Oh, I see. It is. It's just a catalog of all the stuff that Johnson ever wrote, and which I've got over here behind this book. You can barely see it. I have all of Johnson's writings there. So I'll bet if I compared this with that, it might show up to be the same. Should I read this? How much did he write? That's a lot of stuff. I don't think I'll read this. Although I am curious. Oh, what the heck? Let's be thorough. So this is the chronological listing of everything that Johnson wrote, apparently. 1735. Abridgment and translation of Lobo's Voyage to Abyssinia, acknowledged. 1738. Part of a translation of Father Paul Sharp's History of the Council of Trent, acknowledged. N.B. At this work, after some sheets were printed, suddenly stopped. I know not whether any part of it is now to be found. Ooh, maybe a lost work. For the Gentleman's Magazine, Life of Father Paul. 1739, a complete vindication of the licensor of the stage from the malicious and scandalous aspersions of Mr. Brooke, author of Gustav Vasa. That's a title of a book. And then Samuel Johnson, or a prose work that he wrote. And he also wrote Mamor Norfolcis, or an essay on the ancient prophetical inscription in monkish rhyme lately discovered near Lyme in Norfolk by Probus Britannicus. This was for the Gentleman's Magazine. Life of Boerhaave and address to the reader. And there's a little footnote there. I do not here include his poetical works, for, excepting his Latin translation of Pope Messiah, his London and his Vanity of Human Wishes, imitated from Juvenal, his prologue on the opening of Drury Lane Theatre by Mr. Garrett, and his Irene, a tragedy, they are very numerous, in general short, and I have promised a complete edition of them, in which I shall, with the utmost care, ascertain their authenticity and illustrate them with notes and various readings. Boy, Boswell really threw his life at Dr. Johnson, didn't he? Here's another one. This is also written in apparently 1739. Appeal to the public on behalf of the editor. Considerations on the case of Dr. Trapp's sermons. A plausible attempt to prove that an author's work may be abridged without injuring his property. 1740, for the Gentleman's Magazine. A preface. Life of Admiral Drake. Life of Admiral Blake. Life of Philip Barreder. Essays on epithets. 1741, for the Gentleman's Magazine. A free translation of the Jests of Heracles, with an introduction. Debate on the humble petition and advice of the Rump Parliament to Cromwell in 1657, to assume the title of king. Abridged, methodized, and digested. Translation of Abbe Guayon's dissertation on the Amazons. Translation of Fontaine News, wonder what he translated out of. Panegyric, whatever that is, on Dr. Morin. So he was 5 things in 1741. 1742, for the Gentleman's Magazine. He did a lot for the Gentleman's Magazine. Essay on the account of the conduct of the Duchess of Marlborough. An account of the life of Peter Burman. The life of Sydenham, afterwards prefix to Dr. Swain's edition of his works. Proposals for printing Bibliotheca Harlania, or a catalogue of the library of the Earl of Oxford, afterwards prefixed to the first volume of that catalogue, in which the Latin accounts of the books were written by him. These are titles. My goodness. Abridgment entitled Foreign History. Essay on the description of China from the French. 1743. Dedication to Dr. Mead of Dr. James' Medicinal Dictionary. A dictionary. For the Gentleman's Magazine. Parliamentary debates under the name of Debates in the Senate of Lilliput. Isn't that from Gulliver's Travels, Lilliput? From November 19, 1740 to February 23, 1742 to 3 inclusive. Considerations on the dispute between Crouzos and Warburton on Pope's essay on man. A letter announcing that the life of Mr. Savage was speedily to be published by a person who was favored with his confidence. Advertisement for Osborne concerning the Hallaredian catalogue. So that's all the things he wrote in 1743. 1744, he didn't write too much. Here, Life of Richard Savage, Preface to the Harlanian Miscellany, and then for the Gentleman's Magazine, both for the Gentleman's Magazine. In 1745, he wrote miscellaneous observations on the tragedy of Macbeth with remarks on Sir T.H.'s. He was a big fan of Shakespeare, by the way. Editions of Shakespeare and proposals for a new edition of that poet. In 1740, looks like he didn't write anything in 1746. Wonder what was going on in 1746. Let's see. Still like 20 years before the journey to the Hebrides. 1747, he only wrote one thing. Plan for a dictionary of the English language addressed to Philip Dormer, Earl of Chesterfield. So that's the first glimpse that we hear of the actual dictionary that he's going to write, which I think he started in 1750. Let's see. Oh, he wrote in 1748, he wrote two interesting, one that sounds really interesting, Life of Roscommon, whoever that is. But he also wrote something called Vision of Theodore the Hermit. I've got that over there. I'm sure it's in there. I can read that someday. I wonder who Theodore the Hermit was. In 1750, here we have the first edition of the Rambler, which is something Dr. Johnson was quite famous for. In 1750, he wrote the Rambler, the first paper on which was published 20th of March this year, and the last 17th of March, 1752, the day on which Mrs. Johnson died. And there's a footnote there. This is a mistake. The last number of the Rambler appeared on the 14th of March, 3 days before Mrs. Johnson died. I don't know much about Mrs. Johnson's death. In 1750, he also wrote Letter, this is a mouthful, Letter in the General Advertiser to excite the attention of the public to the performance of Comus, which was next day to be acted at Drury Lane Playhouse for the benefit of Milton's granddaughter. Can you just see that? Oh, I've been waiting all day to read that. And then he also wrote Preface and Postscript to Lauder's pamphlet entitled An Essay on Milton's Use of an Imitation of the Moderns in his Paradise Lost. 1751, Life of Cheynell in the miscellany called The Student. He also wrote Letter for Lauder, addressed to the Reverend Dr. John Douglas, acknowledging his fraud with a capital F, concerning Milton in terms of suitable contrition. Whatever that means. I don't know. I wonder why would capital F is somebody's name? Dedication to the Earl of Middlesex of Mrs. Charlotte Lennox, Lennox's female Quixote. Could that be like a female version of Don Quixote? 1753, he wrote, Dedication to John Earl of Orrery, of Shakespeare's illustration, of Shakespeare Illustrated, by Mrs. Charlotte Lennox. He also wrote, during this and the following year, he wrote and gave to his much-loved friend, Dr. Bathurst, the papers in the Adventurer signed T. 1754, Life of Edward Cave in the Gentleman's Magazine. 1755, here we are, a dictionary with a grammar and history of the English language. That's his big work right there. That's the thing that Johnson was known for. So it's 1755. I know it took 9 years for him to write, so that would have been 1746, right, when he started it. An account, and he also wrote, this is a mouthful. Is this the title? An account of an attempt to ascertain the longitude at sea by an exact theory of the variations of the magnetical needle, with a table of the variations at the most remarkable cities in Europe from the year 1660 to 1860. That's a title. This he wrote for Mr. Zachariah Williams, an ingenious ancient Welsh gentleman, father of Mrs. Anna Williams, whom he for many years kindly lodged in his house. It was published with a translation into Italian by Signor Baretti. In a copy of it, which he presented to the Bodleian Library at Oxford, is pasted a character of the late Mr. Zachariah Williams, plainly written by Johnson. So 1755 was the big year. That's the year he did the dictionary. 1756, an abridgment of his dictionary. And of course, it was very popular, so right away he's doing an abridgment. Make it a little more affordable. Apparently, the cost of the dictionary originally would have been like 3 months' salary for a laborer. quite out of the reach of the common man or woman, so that he would, realizing the popularity of the dictionary, that he would come up with a more affordable abridgment the next year. Doesn't surprise us. I don't think it surprises us. Several essays, again in 1756, several essays in the Universal Visitor, which there is some difficulty in ascertaining. All that are marked with 2 asterisks have been ascribed to him. Although I am confident from, this is Johnson speaking now, Boswell, I am confident from internal evidence that we should accept from these the life of Chaucer, reflections on the state of Portugal, and an essay on architecture. And from the same evidence, I am confident that he wrote further thoughts on agriculture and a dissertation of the state of literature and authors. The dissertation on the epithets written by Pope, he afterwards acknowledged and added to his Idler. He also wrote finally in 1756, Life of Sir Thomas Browne, prefaced to a new edition of his Christian Morals. He continues in the same year. In the literary magazine, well, he had a prolific year in 1756. In the literary magazine or Universal Review, which began in January 1756, his original essays are the preliminary address, an introduction to the political state of Great Britain, remarks on the militia bill, observations on his Britannic Majesty's treaties with the Empress of Russia and the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, observations on the present state of affairs, memoirs of Frederick III, King of Prussia. And it goes on, still more in that same year. In the same magazine, his reviews are of the following books. So he wrote reviews of Birch's History of the Royal Society, Browne's Christian Morals, Wharton's Essay on the Writings and Genius of Pope, Volume 1, Hampton's translation of Polybius, Sir Isaac Newton's Arguments in Proof of a Deity. He wrote that? Isaac Newton wrote Arguments in the Proof of a Deity? Borlas's History of the Isles of Sicily, Holmes' Experiments of Bleaching, Brown's History of Jamaica, Hales on distilling seawater, ventilators in ships, and curing an ill taste in milk. What? So this guy Hale wrote something called Distilling Seawater, Ventilators in Ships, and Curing an Ill Taste in Milk. And Johnson wrote a preface to all these. Or he wrote a review. I've got them. I can read them over there because I've got them. Lucius's Essay on Waters, Keith's Catalogue of the Scottish Bishops, Philosophical Transactions, Volume, what is that? I can't even read that Roman numeral. Miscellany by Elizabeth Harrison, Evans' Map and Account of the Middle Colonies in America, The Cadet, a Military Treatise, The Conduct of the Ministry relating to the present war, impartially examined, impartially so you say, and more. Mrs. Lennox's translation of Sully's Memoirs, Letter on the Case of Admiral Byng, Appeal to the Peoples concerning Admiral Byng, Hanway's 8 Days' Journey and Essay on Tea. 8 Days' Journey and Essay on Tea? Some further particulars in relation to the case of Admiral Byng by a gentleman of Oxford. And it goes on. Mr. Jonas Hanway, having written an angry answer to the review of his essay on tea, Johnson, in the same collection, made a reply to it. This is the only instance, it is believed, when he condescended to take notice of anything that had been written against him. And here his chief intention seems to have been to make sport. Couldn't you just hear Johnson doing that? Just ignoring everybody, all the critics, except one, and just to make fun of him. Dedication to the Earl of Rochford of, and preface to, Mr. Payne's Introduction to the Game of Draughts. And finally, in 1756, Introduction to the London Chronicle, an evening paper which still subsists with deserved credit. What a year Dr. Johnson had in 1756 for writing. I wonder if this is due to his newfound fame in 1755 with the dictionary, if suddenly he's flush with work, because he's not rich yet, right? He's still not making a lot of money. The dictionary would not have made him a lot of money. It would have been the publishers that would have made all the money, not Johnson for writing. He received the equivalent of about $250,000 in modern money for that, of which he spent, a large amount on it. I think he had 7 assistants for 9 years doing that. So he burned through a lot of it. So suddenly he's famous, right? He's Dictionary Johnson. Everybody wants him to write something, and now we're seeing that here. He's flush with work. 1756 seems to have been a banner year. 1757, he's cooling down a little bit. Speech on the subject of an address to the throne after the expedition into Roquefort, delivered by one of his friends in some public meeting. It is printed in the Gentleman's Magazine for October 1785, and the first 2 paragraphs of the preface to Sir William Chambers' Designs of Chinese Buildings. Now, 1758, The Idler, which began April 5th of this year and was continued till April 5th, 1760. So the Rambler and The Idler are 2 series that he was quite well known for. In fact, he was referred to sometimes as the Rambler. 1759, Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, a tale. Oh, that's Rasselas. That's a very famous book, a story that he wrote, Rasselas. I've actually heard that one read. I haven't read it myself. I will. Rasselas. So there's a big one there. The dictionary and Rasselas are probably 2 of the big ones for him. In 1759, he also wrote an advertisement for the proprietors of the Idler against certain persons who pirated those papers as they came out singly in the newspaper called the Universal Chronicle or Weekly Gazette. Damn, what plagiarism. For Mrs. Charlotte Lennox's English version of Brummoy, a dissertation on the Greek comedy and the general conclusion of the book. Introduction to the World displayed a collection of voyages and travels. That sounds interesting. 3 letters in the Gazetteer concerning the best plan for Blackfriars Bridge. 1760. Address of the painters to George III on his ascension to the throne. Dedication of Baretti's Italian, an English dictionary to the Marquis d'Abreu, then envoy extraordinary from Spain at the court of Great Britain. Review in the Gentleman's Magazine of M. Tyler's acute and viable and able vindication of Mary Queen of Scots. Introduction to the proceedings of the Committee for Clothing the French Prisoners. He gets around with his topics. Everything from taking the bad taste out of water to clothing French prisoners. I mean, why would he care for the clothing of French prisoners? 1761. Preface to Rolt's Dictionary of Trade and Commerce. Corrections and improvement for Mr. Gwen to the architect's pamphlet entitled Thoughts on the Coronation of George III. 1762. Dedication to the King of the Reverend Mr. Kennedy's Complete System of Astronomical Chronology Unfolding the Scriptures. Where did that come from? A complete system of the astronomical chronology unfolding the scriptures. Some sort of relationship between the scriptures and the stars? 1763. Character of Collins in the Poetical Calendar, published by Fox and Waddy. Dedication to the Earl of Shaftesbury, of the edition of Roger Ascham's English works, published by the Reverend Mr. Bennett. The Life of Ascham, also prefaced to that edition. Review of Telemachus, a Masque, by the Reverend George Graham of Eton College in the Critical Review. Dedication to the Queen of Mr. Hull's translation of Tasso. Account of the detection of the imposture of the cock-laying ghost, published in the newspapers and Gentleman's Magazine. 1764, exactly 200 years before I was born. Part of the review of Granger's Sugarcane, a poem in the London Chronicle. Review of Goldsmith's Traveller, a poem in the Critical Review. 1765, now he's starting to slow down. The Play of William Shakespeare in 8 volumes. The Plays of William Shakespeare in 8 volumes. Well, okay, I eat my words. He's slowing down. What did he do? What does that mean? He didn't write the plays. They were written by Shakespeare. Did he write commentary? I don't know. 1766, The Fountains, a fairy tale in Mrs. Williams's Miscellanies. 1767, Dedication to the King of Mr. Adams' Treatise on the Globes. 1769, Character of the Reverend Mr. Zachariah Mudge in the London Chronicle. 1770, The False Alarm. 1771, Thoughts on the late transactions respecting Falklands Islands. 1772, Defense of a Schoolmaster, dedicated to me for the House of Lords. Arguments in support of the law of vicious intromission, dictated to me for the Court of Session in Scotland. 1773, Preface to Macbean's Dictionary of Ancient Geography. Arguments in favor of the rights of lay patrons, dedicated to me for the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. 1774, The Patriot. 1775, A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland. Proposals for publishing the works of Mrs. Charlotte Lennox in 3 volumes. Preface to Bardetti's Easy Lessons in Italian and English. Taxation No Tyranny, an answer to the resolutions and addresses of the American Congress. Interesting. 1 year before our American Revolution, no less. Arguments on the case of Dr. Memis, dedicated to me for the Court of Sessions in Scotland. Argument to prove that the Corporation of Stirling was corrupt, dedicated to me for the House of Lords. 1776. Argument in support of the right of immediate and personal reprehension from the pulpit, dedicated to me. Proposals for publishing an analysis of the Scotch Celtic language. 1777. Dedication to the King of the posthumous works of Mr. Pearce, Bishop of Rochester. Additions to the life and character of that prelate, prefixed to those works. Various papers and letters in favor of the Reverend Dr. Dodd. 1780. Advertisement for his friend, Mr. Thrall, to the worthy electors of the borough of Southwark. The first paragraph of Mr. Thomas Davies' Life of Garrick. 1781. Prefaces, biographical and critical, to the works of the most eminent English poets, afterwards published with the title of Lives of the English Poets. Argument on the importance of the registration of deeds, dictated to me for the Election Committee of the House of Commons. On the distinction between Tory and Whig, I would like to read that, I will, dictated to me. On vicarious punishments and the great propitiation for the sins of the world by Jesus Christ, dictated to me. Ooh. Vicarious punishments and the great propitiation for the sins of the world. He was a very religious man, by the way. Arguments in favor of Joseph Knight, an African Negro who claimed his liberty in the Court of Sessions in Scotland and obtained it, dictated to me. Defense of Mr. Robinson, printer of the Caledonian Mercury, against the Society of Procurators in Edinburgh for having inserted in his paper a ludicrous paragraph against them, demonstrating that it was not an injurious libel, dictated to me. Yeah, that's a great title there, Dr. Johnson. It's a real eye-catching one. Headlines right there. The greatest part, if not the whole, of a reply by the Reverend Mr. Shaw to a person in Edinburgh of the name of Clark, refuting his arguments for the authenticity of the poems, published by Mr. James McPherson as translations from Ossian. That was a controversy that was going on in the 18th century. For the Ossian tales, which McPherson represented as like long lost classics of representing Scottish tradition, and giving kind of a history and weight and substance to Scottish literature or literary tradition. And Dr. Johnson believed they were a fraud, so that doesn't surprise me that there's that. And Dr. Johnson isn't alone in that. I think that controversy rages to this day about whether the Ossian writings were a fraud, perpetrated by McPherson himself, who would be a great author if that's the case, or if they were in fact the real deal. And we have the last year, 1784, list of the authors of the Universal History deposited in the British Museum and printed in the Gentleman's Magazine for December this year. And then various other years, letters to Mrs. Thrall, prayers and meditations which he delivered to the Reverend Mr. Strawham, enjoining him to publish them, sermons left for publication by John Taylor, LL.D., Prebendary of Westminster, and given to the world by the Reverend Samuel Hayes, A.M. Inter Ev. Such was the number and variety of the prose works of this extraordinary man, which I have been able to discover and am at liberty to mention. But we ought to keep in mind that there must undoubtedly have been many more which are yet concealed, and we may add to the account the numerous letters which he wrote, of which a considerable part are yet unpublished. It is hoped that those persons in whose possession they are will favor the world with him. James Boswell. So that's James Boswell's attempt to summarize the life work of Dr. Johnson with acknowledgement that he probably missed something. Ooh, boo, 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 boo. What am I drinking, Jaco? Alcohol? Yes, it's hard cider. And slurring LOL. Okay, so here we go. Life of Johnson, LLD. Moving a page. And we have a poem from Shakespeare. After my death, I wish no other herald, no other speaker of my living actions, to keep mine honor from corruption, but such an honest chronicler as Griffith. And there's a footnote. See Dr. Johnson's letter to Mrs. Thrall, dated Austick in Skye, September 30th, 1773. And here's a quote, I think. Boswell writes a regular journal of our travels, which I think contains as much of what I say and do as of all other occurrences together. And then quotation mark, for such a faithful chronicler as Griffith. So this is this is James Boswell comparing himself to, recognizing his role as the chronicler of Johnson. How interesting to spend your life, to subordinate your life to the service of the life of someone who you recognize as greater, as Boswell clearly does with Johnson. Little would Boswell know that one day his own journals would be found and brought to light, and his own genius recognized for its own sake. Although, of course, the writing of this book is a masterpiece as well. And here we go, in earnest, the life of Samuel Johnson, LLD. And this is the first paragraph here. I actually had a bookseller, the person that sold me my collection of Johnson, actually, when I told her of my interest in Johnson, she's probably in her 80s, and she kind of grabbed my shirt and she says, come with me. And she drugged me to read this book, and she read the first line that I'm about to read to you, just to convey to me the wonder of the writing within this book. To write the life of him who excelled all mankind in writing the lives of others, and who, whether we consider his extraordinary endowments or his various works, has been equaled by few in any age, is an arduous and may be reckoned to me a presumptuous task. Had Dr. Johnson written his own life in conformity with the opinion which he has given, that every man's life may be best written by himself, had he employed in the preservation of his own history that clearness of narration and elegance of language in which he has embalmed so many eminent persons, the world would probably have had the most imperfect example of biography that was ever exhibited. But although he, at different times, in a desultory manner, committed to writing many particulars of the progress of his mind and fortunes, he never had persevering diligence enough to form them into a regular composition. Of these memorials, a few have been preserved, but the greater part was consigned by him to the flames a few days before his death. Boswell is referring here to the fact that Dr. Johnson had his extant papers burned just a few days before his death, so we will never know those most secret, intimate, private thoughts of Johnson, who committed those to the flames, or had them committed. As I had the honor and happiness of enjoying his friendship for upwards of 20 years, as I had the scheme of writing his life constantly in view, as he was well appraised of this circumstance, and from time to time obligingly satisfied my inquiries by communicating to me the incidents of his early years, as I acquired a faculty in recollecting, and was very assiduous in recording his conversation, of which the extraordinary vigor and vivacity constituted one of the first features of his character, and as I have spared no pains in obtaining materials concerning him from every quarter where I could discover that they were to be found, and have been favored with the most liberal communications by his friends, I flatter myself that few biographers have entered upon such a work as this, with more advantages, independent of literary abilities, in which I am not vain enough to compare myself with some great names who have gone before me in this kind of writing. Since my work was announced, several lives and memoirs of Dr. Johnson have been published, the most voluminous of which is one compiled for the booksellers of London by Sir John Hawkes Knight, a man whom, during my long intimacy with Dr. Johnson, I never saw in his company. I think but once, and am sure not above twice. Johnson might have esteemed him for his decent religious demeanor, and his knowledge of books and literary history. But from the rigid formality of his manners, it is evident that they could never have lived together with companionable ease and familiarity. Nor had Sir John Hawkins that nice perception which was necessary to mark the finer and less obvious parts of Johnson's character. His being appointed one of his executors gave him an opportunity of taking possession of such fragments of a diary and other papers as were left, of which, before delivering them up to the residentiary legatee, whose property they were, he endeavored to extract the substance. In this he has not been very successful, as I have found upon a perusal of those papers, which have been since transferred to me. Sir John Hawkins' ponderous labors, I must acknowledge, exhibit a farrago of which a considerable portion is not devoid of entertainment to the lovers of literary gossiping, but besides its being swelled out with long, unnecessary extracts from various works, even one of several leaves from Osborne's Harleian Catalogue, and those not compiled by Johnson but by Oldys. A very small part of it relates to the person who is the subject of the book, and in that there is such an inaccuracy in the statement of facts as in so solemn an author is hardly excusable, but certainly makes his narrative very unsatisfactory. But what is still worse, there is throughout the whole of it a dark, uncharitable cast, by which the most unfavorable construction is put upon almost every circumstance in the character and conduct of my illustrious friend, who, I trust, will, by a true and fair delineation, be vindicated both from the injurious misrepresentations of this author and from the slighter aspirations of a lady who once lived in great intimacy with him. Ooh, a little slight to Lady Thrall, I think. There is, in the British Museum, a letter from Bishop Warburton to Dr. Birch on the subject of biography, which, though I am aware it may expose me to a charge of artfully raising the value of my own work by contrasting it with that of which I have spoken, is so well conceived and expressed that I cannot refrain here from inserting it. So he inserted the letter itself right here, as Johnson is, or as Boswell is wont to do. Now there's a footnote here that I skipped over. I probably should have gone to it. Back when he was talking about a life of Dr. Johnson compiled by a bookseller, it says here the footnote regarding that book. The greatest part of this book was written while Sir John Hawkins was alive, and I avow that one object of my strictures was to make him feel some compunction for his illiberal treatment of Dr. Johnson. Since his decrease, I have suppressed several of my remarks upon his work, but though I would not war with the dead offensively, I think it necessary to be strenuous in defense of my illustrious friend, which I cannot be without strong, and this is a word I've not heard before, animadversions upon a writer who has greatly injured him. Let me add that though now normally I always look up a word the first time I encounter it, but I don't have a faculty to do that because my phone's right there. So we'll just have to deal with it. Let me add that though I doubt I should not have been very prompt to gratify Sir John Hawkins with any compliment in his lifetime, I do now frankly acknowledge that, in my opinion, his volume, however inadequate and improper as a life of Dr. Johnson, and however discredited by unpardonable inaccuracies in other respects, contains a collection of curious anecdotes and observations which few men but its author could have brought together. Okay, now let's move ahead to the actual reading of the letter that Boswell was referring to. This is Boswell's correspondent writing to him. I shall endeavor, says Dr. Warburton, to give you what satisfaction I can in anything you want to be satisfied in any subject of Milton, and extremely glad you intend to write his life. Almost all the life writers we have had before Toland and Desiderac are indeed strange insipid creatures, and yet I had rather read the worst of them than be obliged to go through with this of Milton's or the other's life of Boileau, where there is such a dull, heavy succession of long quotations of disinteresting passages that it makes their method quite nauseous. But the verbose, tasteless Frenchman seems to lay it down as a principle that every life must be a book. And what's worse, it proves a book without a life. And what do we know of Boileau after all his tedious stuff? You are the only one, and I speak it without a compliment, that by the vigor of your style and sentiments, and the real importance of your materials, have the art, which one would imagine no one could have missed, of adding agreements to the most agreeable subject in the world, which is literary history. November 24th, 1737. So a nice compliment to Johnson's abilities. Now, again, Boswell's abilities. Again, now, Boswell writing. Instead of melting down my material into one mass, and constantly speaking in my own person, by which I might have appeared to have more merit in the execution of the work, I have resolved to adopt and enlarge upon the excellent plan of Mr. Mason in his Memoirs of Gray. Wherever narrative is necessary to explain, connect, and supply, I furnish it to the best of my abilities. But in the chronological series of Johnson's life, which I trace as distinctly as I can, year by year, I produce, wherever it is in my power, his own minutes, letters, or conversation, being convinced that this mode is more lively, and will make my readers better acquainted with him than even most of those who actually knew him, but could know him only partially, whereas there is here an accumulation of intelligence from various points by which his character is more fully understood and illustrated. Indeed, I cannot conceive a more perfect mode of writing any man's life, than not only relating all the most important events of it in their order, but interweaving what he privately wrote and said and thought, by which mankind are enabled, as it were, to see him alive, and to live over, in a kind of a provincial way, live over each scene with him, as he actually advanced through the several stages of his life. Had his other friends been as diligent and ardent as I was, he might have been most entirely preserved. As it is, I will venture to say that he will be seen in this work more completely than any man who has ever yet lived. So Boswell remarking on his due diligence in recording Johnson's life. And he will be seen as he really was, for I profess to write, not his panegyric, which must be all praise, but his life, which, great and good as he was, must not be supposed to be entirely perfect. To be as he was is indeed subject of panegyric enough to any man in this state of being, but in every picture there should be shade as well as light, and I will delineate him without reserve. I do what he himself recommended, both by his precept and his example. If the biographer writes from his personal knowledge and makes haste to gratify the public curiosity, there is danger lest his interest, his fear, his gratitude, or his tenderness overpower his fidelity, and tempt him to conceal, if not to invent. There are many who think it an act of piety to hide the faults or failings of their friends, even when they can no longer suffer by their detection. We therefore see whole ranks of characters adorned with uniform panegyric, and not to be known from one another but by extrinsic and casual circumstances. Let me remember, says Hale, when I find myself inclined to pity a criminal, that there is likewise a pity due to the country. If we owe regard to the memory of the dead, there is yet more respect to be paid to knowledge, to virtue, and to truth. And there's a footnote here from that's from the Rambler. What I consider as a peculiar value of the following work is the quality it contains of Johnson's conversation, which is universally acknowledged to have been eminently instructive and entertaining, and of which the specimens that I have given upon a former occasion have been received with so much approbation that I have good grounds for supposing that the world will not be indifferent to more ample communications of a similar nature. That the conversation of a celebrated man, if his talents have been exerted in conversation, will best display his character is, I trust, too well established in the judgment of mankind to be at all shaken by a sneering observation of Mr. Mason in his memoirs of Mr. William Whitehead's, in which there is literally no life, but a mere dry narrative of facts. I do not think it quite necessary to attempt a deprecation of what is universally esteemed, because it was not to be found in the immediate object of the ingenious writer's pen. For in truth, from a man so still and so tame as to be contented to pass away many years as the domestic companion of a superannuated lord and lady, conversation could no more be expected than from a Chinese mandarin on a chimney piece, or the fantastic figures of a gilt leather screen. If authority be required, let us appeal to Plutarch, the prince of ancient biographers. And then there's a whole bunch of Greek right there. I think that's probably a good enough place to stop for tonight. So we've actually made it into the book proper itself, and we're making some headway. Clearly, Boswell has set quite a task out for himself, huh? Well, let's go ahead and stop for tonight. Thank you for joining me for this reading of The Life of Johnson by James Boswell. Take care, everybody. Make it a great day. Bye-bye.